And greetings and welcome to the QCast. This is season 4, episode 34. We're officially in, I guess, what I'll call championship season. We had a big milestone completed yesterday, which is the first regional rankings. And I'm really thrilled and honored to have the Men's Basketball National Committee Chair, Luke Flockerzi, with me here today. And Luke, as everyone knows, is the head men's basketball coach at Rochester as well. That's his day job. And now he's got this side gig, which is, I can't imagine how much work. But Luke, I mean, do you feel good having kind of checked the box and gotten through a huge first step yesterday? And like, how do you feel that all went?
Oh, it's just such an exciting time. Once we get to the regional rankings and we start to lay the foundation for our tournament selections and our upcoming tournament, which I think is going to be exceptional given the parity we have going on right now. It's hard not to just kind of smell March in the air and start to just be excited about what's to come. I think there's been a lot of work done already, laying that foundation even before the alphabetical regional rankings were released. And I'm sure we'll get into some more of the nitty gritty there, but including why they're alphabetized. So, I feel good about our work so far and just excited about the work we have ahead.
Yeah, and for those tuning into the QCast, what we'll do today is we'll just kind of review where we are in the process. We'll talk about some of the key details. Towards the end of the conversation, we'll get into a couple regions in particular and just ask Luke to talk about kind of the methodology that the committee uses in doing regional rankings. And the last thing we'll talk about is kind of the topic of what I'll call equality, equity. I'm not sure what quite the right word is. It's a little something that you talked to Dave McHugh about on Hoopsville with the women's basketball chair. It's something that we texted about just a little bit, so I want to get into that towards the end. Let's do this. Let's bring up a little deck here.
2024, we're new age on the QCast.
Yeah, I mean those who think that the QCast doesn't produce are having just a nightmare week right here, Luke.
We
Because
got a star on this one.
this is production. There's now a QCast logo, and we have a star. So things are really rolling right now. But let's talk through where we are at this moment. Is yesterday your committee completed regional ranking number 1, which was a really big step in the process. So you can check the box there. Talk us through now what the group is working on today and moving forward. Kind of walk us through some of these dates a little bit.
Yeah, let's come up to speed here. So we had a practice ranking last week, which I think was more pronounced than normal for me because we do have a lot of new RAC members and even new national committee members. And so that call was a little bit longer than normal as we kind of get our feet under us and all understand the process. And that transitioned into this week's first public ranking, which is alphabetized. And so I thought that, our work was really good. Everyone, it was a long call, but it was very productive. And I think we really laid a great foundation for our tournament moving forward. Just to reiterate, those are released alphabetized because we were missing a huge piece of everyone's resume, which is the results versus regional ranked opponents. That is a change that is a national change across all sports, but our men's basketball committee fought for that change because we were seeing huge swings in rankings from week 1 to week 2 once we added that information, and just because we didn't have a full resume to consider, and so it didn't seem right. And so there's been a lot of kind of comments on trying to continue to fix that. And I think that the men's basketball committee is in agreement. We would love to see some further changes, but as you know, some of these changes are glacial, and I would like to see some improvements there moving forward. We've talked about making the practice ranking alphabetical, which there's some pros and cons to, but certainly I think there's room to continue to make some positive changes there. So based on the alphabetical rankings, we will add results versus regional ranked opponents to consider next week. Those are on a 1-week delay. And so next week, for the first time, we will have 5 primary criteria to consider for most of our comparisons as we determine a numeric regional ranking to be released next Tuesday, February 13th.
And I I think after a couple years of this alphabetical thing, or a few years, I think people have caught on to it. I think I only had one Twitter comment of like, "Why is Calvin ranked ahead of Trine?" You know, and I was able to throw it out there because, you know, the alphabetically C is before T. But that just one instance on Twitter, Luke. I think you'd agree people are starting to catch on that this is how region or ranking number one works, correct?
Correct. I think I've only had one too, and we did a great service to the community this year by not putting numbers in front of our alphabetized rankings.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. That really confuses people. So we're kind of in this great time, and then remind me the top 16 reveal. Where does that fit into all of this?
It's coming up next week. So after we complete our week two rankings, and those are published on February 13th, our national committee will turn right around and produce a top 16 reveal that'll be released on Hoopsville on Thursday, February 15th.
That's great. So we'll all tune into Hoopsville again. Worked out great last year. I assume that Dave has both the men's and women's side of the top 16 coming again, which was great last year. So yeah,
Correct.
this is where we are, folks. We're at this great time of year where we're knee deep in it, and every game for teams that are remotely in the picture are enormous because we're at this point where we're ranking teams, and so you know, it goes without saying that this is a great time of year. Wanted you to talk across two fronts about your committees. The first is the group that we call the National Committee, of which you're the chair of. And then after this, we'll talk about the regional advisory committees, the RACs. But first, talk about your national committee, if you would.
Yeah, we have a great group. Obviously, all 10 regions have a regional advisory chair, which serves on the men's basketball national committee. So, for example, Paul Booth in Region 1 is the head men's basketball coach at Norwich. He serves as the chair of the Region 1 RAC, and then he'll bring his RAC's rankings to our national committee for further discussion. So in Region 2, Stephanie Dollar is the Deputy AD at UMass Boston. She's a new member to our RAC, our committee, sorry. I'm in Region 3. Region 4 is John Alisi, returning in his second year, Assistant AD and head men's basketball coach at Baruch, as you can see. Other new ones, Gary Stewart in Region 5, joining us this year for the first year. Danny Miller in Region 6 is also new. Tim Groves down in Region 9 is also new. So vice chairs this year with me are Cam Fuller, Doc Esslinger, returning members who bring some great perspective to our work and kind of our group here to lead the charge.
Yeah, so this committee has a lot on their shoulders in a leadership capacity as the process plays out. And then, you know, the regional advisory committees, as you mentioned, you know, like the chair or the lead of each RAC is on the national committee, but a lot of work gets done right here, region to region with the RACs. Talk about their role a little bit, if you would, Luke.
It's a vital role, and their work is very important to what we're doing. It certainly streamlines our work. If we had to have the level of detail that each RAC has on their weekly RAC calls leading into our national calls, you know, we would probably triple the amount of time that the national committee has to spend. So they do a lot of the foundational work for our national committee calls. So these happen kind of Sunday night into Monday, where the regional advisory committees will meet and determine their rankings. They'll then, like I said, the chair of each region will bring kind of those rankings to the national committee for further discussion, and then they kind of get finalized by the national committee before they're posted on Tuesday. So every conference has a representative on a RAC, and so you can see as we just switch here to Region 7, the AMCC has Dave Nyland. MIAA, NCAA, COAC, PAC all have their own kind of representatives of their league. I think it's important, you know, you're not really on these RACs to fight for your conference or your team. You're there to represent and offer any sort of insight into some of the conversation that might be happening as to, you know, why data might be the way it is. And, you know, this group in Region 7 is just trying to get their rankings correct so we can work towards selecting the right 20 teams for our championship. So, but again, their work is very important to what we do on the national committee.
And just an appreciation for folks of, you know, these people all have have full-time jobs, whether they're basketball coaches or, athletic directors or SIDs, whatever they are, this role is just above and beyond. You've had to balance that now for a few years. And what is the time commitment like, Luke, when you're trying to do, you're trying to coach Rochester and do all the prep and you're recruiting and all these things, and yet you're doing all this other stuff. What is that balance like?
Yeah, it's hard. I'm fortunate. We have some great staff here. Our assistant coaches are phenomenal, and they do a great job kind of helping prepare the team in addition to what I'm able to do. But it is a big volunteer commitment outside of coaching basketball or administrative responsibilities that our national committee members have. And even on the racks, it is a big commitment at the beginning of the week. So I have the benefit of kind of having the UAA schedule right now, which is nice. Mondays are off day because we play Friday, Sunday, and there's a little bit more of a window for me at the beginning of the week. But I always feel for our coaches who are playing on Monday or Tuesday night that are on the committee and kind of have to battle that game prep with, being on a 4+ hour national call on a Tuesday morning. So.
Right. Let's see. So we always have to talk about the primary selection criteria. I think it's just a great opportunity to remind viewers of the QCast how things work in terms of like what's used to make regional rankings, and then ultimately what's used to select teams and seed teams and all those things. If you would just do a quick refresher on the 5 primary selection criteria and how those are all used.
Yeah, this is it. I mean, this is our prescribed selection criteria, the primary. So these are the ones that we spend 99% of our time on. As we compare teams, these are the categories we're comparing. And some things to note, it's win-loss percentage, right? It's not quantity of wins.
Good point.
And so that's always something to point out. And it's against Division III opponents. Non-Division III contests are counted in secondary criteria. Division III head-to-head competition is a little bit more straightforward. Your games against someone you're being compared to. Are there any direct results? Results versus common Division III opponents is always something that it needs some qualification in the sense that it's not win-loss percentage. It is results. And so there's some room for interpretation there. Our committee has kind of trended towards looking for quality results in that category. Not that we're diminishing losses or not considering those as well, or quantities of opportunities, but we are certainly not thinking of that category as a winning percentage. We're drilling down and looking into that more. One that is I'm skipping one, but that is very kind of a hot topic is strength of schedule. Obviously, that's not a raw number. It's not exact. It's actually a formula that goes into that strength of schedule calculation. So it's a combination of your opponent's average winning percentage and your opponent's winning percentage. And on the men's side in Division III, there's also a home away multiplier associated with those numbers. So it's a 0.75 for a home game, it's 1 for a neutral game, and it's 1.25 for an away game. So that all gets factored in to create that strength of schedule number that gets referenced quite frequently. And then the one that kind of gets overlooked a lot, that I think, we have some great people doing math out there in the Division III world right now, but you don't see the common opponent category listed very often, just because who's ranked, who are we comparing?
Right.
And so a lot, that's a piece of a weighted piece of the scale that we need to consider here, and not always something that's discussed in kind of some of those public conversations. So that is if we're comparing team A to team B, who are the common opponents they've played? Obviously, if you are in the same conference as team B, there's going to be a lot of games in that category. If you're not, there might only be one, and that one could be very significant if it also happens to be a highly ranked regional opponent that's not in your conference. So those are all pieces of the primary criteria. And if you stay with me, I'm going to share this analogy because I think it's been beneficial for some people. So we're picturing an old school balance, like a weighted scale, right? And so when we're comparing these teams, when we're making ranking decisions or selection decisions, each one of these primary criteria has an advantage or a disadvantage in different categories. And we have to determine, how big of a weight that is. And we're putting it on that balance, that scale in favor of that team. And once we put all the weight on one side or the other, we're evaluating the total resume to decide kind of who has the advantage at the end of the day. So, as an example, a small common opponent win, let's say it's 9-2 to 8-3, and we drill down and the 9-2 team should get credit for that. We have to decide to put a small sliver on that side of the scale to give it a little bit more weight. Whereas if there's a huge disparity in that column, let's say one's 10-0 and one's 5-5, the size of that weight we're putting on the scale is going to be bigger. And that all impacts, how we're considering, the combination of win-loss and SOS. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight and something to picture when we talk about balancing a total resume throughout this process.
I think it's very helpful just for people to realize it's all of the criteria that you're stacking on that side of the balance. And a couple other points that you made just to stress is it is win-loss percentage and not number of wins. And so like when we talk about this stuff, you talk about, 0.800 versus 0.856 and not talking about, people that are, 19-2 or whatever. And the second thing that you said, I think, just to point out, is that it's only Division III opponents that count here in the primary. So, like, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, Calvin was still playing that NAI tournament, I believe, and there was an NAI game or two that counted in the record, but it didn't count in this process. So these are Division III games, correct, Luke? Am I saying that right?
Correct. And it might be one reason why you see a team play, 2 or 3 less games than someone they're being compared to is they have non-Division III contests in there, or they just haven't played as many counting games like the University of Hartford, for example, in the CCC this year
Right.
does not count. So you're going to see some CCC schools that have lower total contests that have to be considered.
I remember, I can't remember which SCIAC schools it is. Maybe it's a few that there's several NAI type games on those schedules. So those would be counting in their records as you pull up their stats, but they would not be counting in the primary criteria. Moving into eligible teams, just to point out here for people, there's a certain amount of eligible Division III men's basketball teams in each of the 10 regions. There's always kind of schools moving in and moving out potentially. This is the list or the number for this season. It totals up to 413, which, first of all, Luke, this is the largest division of NCAA competition, correct? So like 413, I don't know what the numbers are for D1 and D2, but we have a pretty darn big universe of schools in Division III, correct?
Yeah, that's a large number, and so we're kind of past capacity for all the ratios that the NCAA uses. So we are ranking. The committee will rank 20% of the eligible teams, but it's capped at 7 per region, and so some of those 7 is less than 20. So that's kind of unfortunately how it works. We're also at max capacity for our bracket right now. We have 64 qualifying teams, and so that's not going to grow past 64 the way that the championships committee has the rules right now.
And if you look at the total number of teams ranked, 9 of the regions have 7 teams ranked based on that ratio, and Region 2 has 6. There's 69 teams that are ranked, and when you think about that, Luke, that's just 17% of the men's basketball universe. So, the reason you guys have to work so hard is you are narrowing this down to a pretty elite group of teams that end up each week as regionally ranked. I mean, 17%, that's a pretty small sliver of the universe here.
Yeah, and I'm reminded about it constantly when we get to this type of year. Being regionally ranked is a huge accomplishment.
Yep.
And it means that you're having a great season and that something that you and your institution should be proud of. And so you see people tweeting out that, this is the first time we've been ranked, or we haven't been ranked in 10 years. And, you have an appreciation for the importance of what we're doing as a committee. I mean, it's a huge deal. And so there's not as much opportunity to be ranked in men's basketball because of the 413 teams. But when you do, it's something you should definitely be proud of. And part of why we take our job so seriously is we want to make sure we're getting the right teams in there.
One more thing that I realized I wanted to ask you on the date slide. Do I have it correct regarding teams that count as regionally ranked opponents at the very end, the final ranking when you're doing all the selecting? is it the teams that are in rankings, the ranking 3 teams, are those locked in as regionally ranked teams? Let's say one falls out from 3 to 4. Is that team locked in as a regionally ranked team?
Yeah, so the last rankings that are published before selections, all of those teams will be ranked
Gotcha.
throughout the process from that moment forward, which I believe is ranking 3. And then we will re-rank the National Committee ranking 4 on Sunday, February 25th there. That will not be published until after the selections, but that could involve new ranked teams that would also be considered as results versus regional ranked opponents. So some people refer to that ranking 3 as once ranked, always ranked at that stage. The teams in ranking 1 and ranking 2 do not remain. So if you happen to have a win against a regional ranked opponent in ranking 2, and then that team moves out of the rankings for ranking 3 and isn't ranked again, you will not get credit for that in the selection process.
It's a great point. I think it's an important point for fans that are trying to follow along. I know a lot of people are, and let's say that you're a Calvin fan and you really want Marietta to be regionally ranked. Well, don't quite celebrate ranking 1 and don't quite celebrate ranking 2 if Marietta's in there. But if you get Marietta in there in ranking 3 and you're a Calvin fan, now you're good because you know that that's going to quote count at the end. So I just wanted to make sure to bring that up. I think that's important for people to know.
What the Snyders are really hoping for is that someone who's ranked in Region 3 that they're getting credit for moves out, and a new team that also gives them credit for moves in ranking 4. That's the dream there.
The perfect scenario, right? And they've got it all figured out. These guys are, I mean, they are DataCast guys, and that's a great lead in. It's a great lead in. You mentioned the Snyders. So these guys, the Snyders, Luke, they run a show. It's called D3 DataCast. And they did a really good show yesterday, just an hour after the alphabetical ranking came out, where they took their 10 region projections and they laid over the real alphabetical ranking. And for the most part, I think they got all but like 4 or 5 of these things right. Now there were a couple regions where I just picked 2 regions in particular. I picked 2 regions. I screenshotted it. I gave them a little love. Look, there's their logo, the D3 DataCast. It doesn't really look like either one of them, by the way. But so I wanted to ask you, and I don't expect that we're able to get into a ton of like what the RAC decided here, but one of the areas that they got wrong was they had St. Vincent in Region 7, and it ended up being Marietta in. And they made a good point on this one because this is a situation where there's only 2 of the primary criteria that are in play here, winning percentage and SOS, because there isn't a common opponent and there isn't a head-to-head and there's no RROs yet. So their question or point on their show was, how does Marietta's combination of 667-554 get above St. Vincent's combination of 833-515? I'm going to lob that to you. I don't know what level you want to take that, but I think it's a good question.
It's a great topic here, and there's a lot to discuss. Those first alphabetical rankings are, we take them very seriously because at the end, who's ranked in that 6th, 7th spot, is going to be meaningful moving forward. And so we spent a vast majority of our call on Tuesday as we finalized our first rankings on who are in those spots. And so it's a great question. I think that it's very easy to look at these and think of these conversations as completely linear, meaning that, obviously Team A is better than Team B, which is better than Team C, which is better than Team D, and kind of go all the way down. And so I think what is lost on how much time we spend trying to decide between multi-team comparisons. And so very often there's, maybe the 2, 3, 4 in a region that are really, really hard to separate. And we talk about these as triangles because Team A is better than Team B and Team B is better than Team C,
Right.
but Team C is better than Team A. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, who deserves to be ranked in those situations, both at the bottom and the top. And obviously, as they get down to the bottom, it becomes more and more important. So I've referenced this on some other shows already. I mean, part of this is understanding, like, who's a team being compared to. And so you might say, all right, this team down here, number 10, hey, they beat number 6. How come they're not in
Right.
front of number 6? They won head to head. Well, they maybe never got compared to number 6 because of the way these separations happened. Two, maybe they were part of a grouping, and the only way that our committee could make sense of that grouping was to really dive deep, and all of a sudden that head-to-head result didn't carry weight in that 3-team comparison. Not that it wasn't factored in, just that it didn't necessarily carry as much weight in that scenario. So to think that at the end here, this is just a 2-team comparison and there's nothing else to be considered, even though there's limited data, might not be the entire scenario. So that's one. So also, this is a great example of how all regions aren't equal. All right, you pulled up Region 7 here, and I'm glad you did. It's extremely strong region. There are 10 teams in this region that have above a 667 winning percentage, and at least a 515 SOS. Right, there's regions that would love for more of these types of resumes to be available to them as we rank them. So part of that is, there are disparate resumes in here too. There's high winning percentage, low SOS, relatively low SOS, obviously. There's high SOS, low winning percentages, and then there's kind of more balanced resumes. And so that all kind of gets discussed. And, when we really, really get to close comparisons, very often it has to come down to a vote. And, that isn't always going to make, mathematical perfect sense. There might be, hey, that's, 0.00003 away from this comparison that we did over in this region. And, why is it not the same? Well, we're confident that, we got to the right place and we got the right teams ranked.
Now you mentioned deep regions, and then, for the life of me, I still can't wrap my head around the fact that my home region, as I call it, the region that my team is in, is not one of the deep regions anymore, because we were with the WIAC forever, and that wasn't any fun. Now, I think this is a good example though, where you see whatever team on here is legitimately the 7th of the ranked teams. You probably compare it to would St. Vincent have made it in? We could get into that, but this is a region that isn't as deep as the one that we just talked about in terms of purely the resumes. Now, on this one, again, to whatever detail you can get into on this, is they had St. Norbert at 818, 462 with a win over Wisconsin Lutheran in. Carthage, 667. Not a huge SOS, relatively speaking, 501. Wins over Elmhurst and Anderson. So I guess, you've got a lot of the criteria in play here, right? So you've got SOS, you've got winning percentage. So talk a little bit, if you would, Luke, around, maybe just to reinforce what you just said, like in St. Norbert versus Carthage, how did the RAC go about that?
Yeah, so ironically, I'm sure the Snyders would be quick to point out it's the same SOS difference. It's, I think, 0.039 for both of them. Again, so this might not have ever been a direct comparison, right? It could easily be part of a 3-team comparison that
Right.
somehow got parceled out a different way. I think what's notable here in Region 8, like you mentioned, there's only 3 teams that met that same threshold that we just talked about in Region 7. That there were 10 teams that had a 667 and a 515 SOS. So part of it is who you're being compared to and in what region. It's not an exact science, but I do think there's some discussion on where these numbers are. Obviously, comparing a 462 SOS to a 501 is different than comparing on the last screen. It was a 554 and a 515. Right. So that's certainly going to be part of a conversation that's being had. Whether that leads us to a different conclusion is really based on who you're being compared to and what region you're in, and who else you're being compared to.
And I think earlier in this, I misspoke a little bit when I said there's a lot of criteria in play, because I have to remind myself that the RROs aren't part of this thing yet, right? So, when you think of some of these teams that have wins over teams that are now regionally ranked, that is not part of what happened yesterday with the alphabetical ranking. So that alphabetical ranking is it seems like it's challenging in some ways, Luke. I mean, you're limited more in your criteria that you're using than when you get busy with number 2 coming up next week. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so not using results versus regional ranked opponents this week is part of the reason why we have those alphabetical. And the less data and resume we have to compare, the harder some of these comparisons become, not easier, which is kind of counterintuitive. And so very often if we get a 3-team or a 4-team comparison with disparate resumes, like, we really have to parcel that out and make some decisions with limited information. So again, it's not always perfect.
Yeah. So what happens now is, now that the rankings are done, now they can overlay, and right now that they're looking at what are the regionally ranked opponent, what's that data like? And so if you're looking at like Elmhurst, Elmhurst has wins over Illinois Wesleyan that's regionally ranked, and Carthage that's regionally ranked, et cetera. So that now becomes a big part, or a part. It becomes it's on the balance for the next regional ranking, where it didn't count at all this time. And then final topic, Luke. This is something that I think you did a good job of getting into with
Can we go
Dave.
back real quick just to that
Yeah.
last one? So
Yeah.
keeping the analogy of putting that weight on the scale, we see these head to head is not results versus regional ranked opponents. So let me make sure that no one's thinking that, but we can see some regionally ranked opponents in this category. And so these results are going to go on the balance, right? Like, so we need to determine, like, if Illinois Wesleyan hypothetically is 3-2 against regional ranked opponents, we got to determine the size of that weight to go on their side of the balance, right? And so that's how that would then get added to a total resume to start making sense of all 5 primary criteria. I think our committee has been very transparent and very consistent in, when things get really, really close, we're also looking and drilling down into the quality of those results versus regional ranked opponents. And so if it is a close comparison, a win against number 1 in region 7, which we just showed you is a very, very strong region, is going to have a little bit more weight than a win against a region 18 school that is ranked 4th. And hopefully that makes sense. I mean, that's kind of what the committee is going to consider to a degree.
And I do like the balance analogy, because yeah, you've got 2 teams sitting on there, right? We're doing this and we continue to get data in the primary criteria, stacking things onto each side. The best example I can remember of, regarding like the head to head, this goes back years now, but there was a year where Illinois Wesleyan beat Wheaton 3 times, 3-0. And Wheaton was ranked higher, and they should have been, because when you took the 4 other primary criteria, it still landed in favor of Wheaton, because I can't remember the situation, the winning percentage, the SOS, everything else was so much higher that I remember at the time was like, well, they're 3-0 against them, they have to be ranked higher. That's one of head to head is one of 5 criteria that you're stacking up on that side of the balance. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And so getting to that head-to-head analogy, like we had some comparisons this week where a team did have a head-to-head advantage and ended up, behind them, let's say.
Right.
That's based on the overall resume being obviously stronger and making up for the difference in that head-to-head, meaning it had more weight on the balance to overcome that. And or it was part of a 3 or 4 team comparison. And all of a sudden, although that head-to-head in a direct linear comparison really, really matters, when you add a 3rd team and you're comparing total resumes, and you can't really say, well, we can't just compare A and B because C is just as strong, so we have to compare all 3 of them together.
Right.
That can also change a head-to-head situation. In a different region, we had a 3-team comparison at a point where, team A was 2-0 against team B. Team B was 2-0 against team C, but team C was 2-0 against team A.
Right.
And so, like, in a sense, like, if we felt like those 3 were close enough that they had to be compared together, that primary criteria is a wash, right? Because you can't give anyone more weight for the results. And let's say one was just 1-0, it'd be a little bit less weight for that team, right? So I hopefully that analogy is helpful in understanding when it's not just lip service when we say we're comparing the total resume and the totality of a team's kind of resume as we are making these comparisons.
Final question on that head-to-head piece, because that was one of the things that came up on the data cache show. Can't remember the exact example. It was I think the point they were making is, team A won at team B. It was like a road win. When you're looking at that head-to-head stuff, do you look at it differently where it is? So like Illinois Wesleyan won at WashU. Elmhurst beat Illinois Wesleyan at Elmhurst. Do you look at home road, or is a win regardless? Like just talk us through whatever part of that you can.
Yeah, so there's a gradient to that, right? So when we're talking common opponents, when we talk about drilling down, we can't just look on the first page there and see, an 8-2 and an 8-2 and say it's a wash, because when you actually look at those results and what those results are, they could lead you to a different conclusion. One team maybe had lost to the same team twice, whereas the other team had different results that were in their favor. And so, it really is an individual drilled down comparison when we're looking at common opponents. And I'd say, we talk in a sense of like, if team A got the road win at team B, and team B also had that opportunity to get the road win and didn't, right? That factors in maybe more than if team B didn't have a chance to play that road game and it's a 0, right? So, and that, let's say 1-1 might, or 2-1 might not always be the same, based on where the games were and who's had a chance to play which. But there are kind of gradients to like who has an advantage in that primary criteria category.
Before we leave this, I guess I'll say something that Mike Schauer said back when I was doing this with him, however many years ago, which is, I'll use my own version, that if guys that have a podcast, Matt and Zach Snyder, can get, how many teams do we regionally rank? We're 69. I think they got like 64 or 65 of these things right. If they can get 65 right, if people that are guessing pool C's can consistently get 19 of the 20 right, it means that the system, Luke, is, while there's room for healthy debate, the system's got to be pretty clear if those of us that follow it can get that much accurately. Is that a fair way that you can look? I mean, that's how Mike looked at it. Like, the system's out there. We try to make sure we're transparent. And if you really follow along, you can get pretty close. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Our mission here is to, ever since I've been on the national committee, is to be as completely transparent as possible. This is not national security, I think is the term that Mike Schauer would use. We want to be transparent with our process, and the data is very transparent. And, the people who are following along and listening and trying to replicate what we're saying we're doing are getting very, very close to the same conclusions.
Yeah.
And so whether or not the criteria is something you agree with is up for debate. I personally don't agree with all the criteria. I think there's tons of room for improvement, but you have to understand that, the championships committee is trying to apply the same criteria to all sports, which are inherently different. So I will say for the Snyders, they did kick the can down the road on some of their final, 6 or 7s in their regions, and they didn't really take a hard stance on what they thought was going to be the conclusion. So, I'm not even counting some of those misses as misses, because they never really took a stand on those.
You're right. It was a very soft process. And there were some disclaimers. If you really listen to their show, Matt did all the work. Zach would say we, but then Matt would say I. And if we want to have a show about that sometime, I would like to. But it was really Matt doing it. And Zach, of course, is the pretty face of the two, and he's the host, which I understand why they do what they do. So shouts to the Snyders. Now let's go to this one, Luke. This is where we'll kind of wrap up. This is some good stuff. I think you got into this with Dave on Hoopsville, which I appreciated. We texted about it just a little bit in preparation for this. These first two bullets are kind of things that we batted around. So there's 2 questions. I'll throw them first out there, and you can take them however you want. The question is, does each team have the same opportunity to get a pool C bid? And does each team have the same opportunity to get the same data? So you take those wherever you want, and I'm sure I'll have a follow-up or 2.
So this is my personal kind of interpretation of this conversation. I'm not necessarily speaking for the men's basketball committee. I do think that there's a lot of coaches out there who feel like they're starting every season at a disadvantage when it comes to getting a
Sure.
pool C. And I think by nature, all teams have the same opportunity to get pool C bids, but there are inherent advantages and disadvantages that exist in the Division III landscape. And I can point out a number of them for you. The easiest one is, the geographical landscape. Like,
Sure.
there's some island teams that just don't have the same ability as a team in the density of New England to kind of pick and choose their games. And so I think each team does not have the same opportunity to get the same data because of that, right? Another great example is some of the conferences out there require 22 league games out of
Right.
25 game schedule, or 21, 20, whatever it is. And some are playing single round robin. So there's just a natural regression to the mean when you're playing that many conference games, and they are not going to have the same quality of SOS that is an option for them. So those are just two quick examples. There's probably 10, 20, 30 different things that are easy to point to where there's just inherent advantages and disadvantages in our Division III world. Now, is that wrong? Like, Division I certainly doesn't take that into account. Their at-large process is very much focused on getting what they perceive to be the best teams into their NCAA tournament. It's kind of how Division II works. It's how Division III has always worked. And so I think the contrast that's important to recognize is that, in Division III, so much of our pillars and as an identity is built on kind of having equal access to things, and through those 413 basketball schools. And I think that right now, those schools are guaranteed equal access to our tournament through the 42 automatic qualifying
Right.
bids that are out there. And I'm not saying I, necessarily agree or disagree, but if, we want that same access to pool Cs, that there's going to have to be some changes to our criteria. There's going to have to be some changes to our process. And it can't just be left up to every committee to decide, how they want, the discount for these inherent advantages and disadvantages. I think that's a really slippery slope that I'd be scared to see committees try to
Right.
attempt to change numbers or factor things in because of those things that they know exist in Division III.
So if I hear you correct, I think what you're saying is like Division I and Division II, Division III is trying to select the best teams for the tournament, and it's not currently it's not in the manual or the rules, so to speak. It's not in there to try to account for some of these challenges. Like that team's SOS is low because of geography or because their league schedule is 22 league games. The process currently doesn't really have a mechanism to take that in place, and we're comparing the data versus the data across the board, apples to apples. Correct?
Yeah, and I think that, we're, as a committee, as a selection process, have been steadily moving away from the subjective, and I think every year getting more and
Yeah.
more to the objective data, and possibly, if we move to a computerized selection process, being even more objective on face value. And so to think that a committee would try to discount for that and subjectively determine, you know, what does someone's SOS mean because of the fact that they couldn't get a better SOS, I think was, again, a really slippery slope, and not something that I'm necessarily in favor of.
Yeah. So I think that's well said. And I think it's good to just hear the chair of the men's basketball committee acknowledge that that is what it is. So if you're talking about some of these teams in the Northwest Conference or the SCIAC in California or wherever that have a tougher time getting quality opponents, then you get into slippery slopes like the ability to fundraise. And I'm just going to take like Cal Lutheran's done a good job of bringing. They brought Illinois Wesleyan, they brought Tufts, they went to play Randolph-Macon, they went to play Hood. Well, not everyone has the ability to get on a plane and fly all over the place to play games. Whitworth had Elmhurst come this year, I believe. Whitworth has gone all over the country to play games. Um, I think of teams that have had SOS issues and really changed them quickly, like Yeshiva, Shrine, Barry, Maryville, I think Calvin. These are just off the top of my head. Like teams have flipped their SOS by committing to it, but not every school, Luke, has the same ability or resources to just to do that. And we'll leave it at that. Anything you'd like to add to that whole topic here on this slide?
No, I think that's a great example at the end is, there are some conferences out there who, have some weaker members from a record standpoint, from a win-loss standpoint. And some of those games hurt the best teams in that league's SOS, and there's no doubt about it. And so I completely can have sympathy for those coaches who feel like they're in that starting place. And so you pointed out some great examples recently of some teams that have had a low SOS issue that's really impacted their overall resume, who have responded by going out,
Right.
some nationally, some have figured it out more on a regional level, but they've played a drastically different schedule and increased their SOSs.
Yep.
And so those case studies are fascinating because, we have people who are criticizing kind of both sides of that coin, and to see in a short amount of time, a 2-3 year span, that same team go out and play a tougher schedule. Some have done it to greater success than others. And so we kind of are almost seeing the balance between winning percentage and SOS before our eyes in real case studies. Like, all right, what if this team actually goes out and plays a stronger schedule? Well, what's their record going to be? And so we've seen some of those case studies, which I think has been really fascinating if you're really paying attention.
And there are leagues that are even attacking it at a league level, like the MIAC is going to at some point soon start playing less conference games, specifically, I think, due to this, specifically so they can go out and play more non-conference games. And so there are leagues that are trying to deal with this, and it's a reality. And I think it's good to talk about it and get it on the table.
The new target in our association here is kind of these leagues folding and leagues merging. And I mean, I've been in Division III sports for the last 27 years, and I have never seen it to this degree as
Right.
far as, leagues like the C2C and, other leagues coming and going. And even in upstate New York, we've had some, some schools close. And so I think there's a little bit of a panic right now to make sure that, leagues are sustainable. And I think that's another layer to not necessarily having complete control over your membership from a conference level. And so, there are a ton of layers to this conversation, and way above my pay grade as I volunteer for this position. So I'll leave that to somebody else to figure out.
Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed the conversation here, and I think you'll get a ton out of it. It is a great time of year. You think about the magnitude of these games. If you follow the process and you understand numbers and how it works, I'm sitting here grinding out this Elmhurst game at Illinois Wesleyan tonight, and I understand as a fan the implications of a win or a loss in the SOS and the winning percentage and the RROs. And I think that's one of the fun times of year, the fun part of the year, Luke, for fans that follow this is, I mean, every game that's played now has implications in all this in some way, right?
You find yourself rooting for two teams you never even thought about at the beginning of the year, just because
Oh
how it
man.
might impact your team's schedule. And that's fascinating. But I could say unequivocally, the best game of the day is Grinnell College versus Illinois College for first place in the
It's a
MWC.
great one. And you know what? It hit me last night, and then I'll ask for your final thoughts. It hit me. I was like, okay, who are my next guests? And I started lining them up, and it's two Grinnell guys right in a row. It's Luke Flockerzi, proud Grinnell Hooper, and then I think it's Kai Tahuki. I hope I'm saying Kai's name right. He's the leading scorer in Division III. And before, now this is me standing up for Grinnell, which this is a new thing, but before everyone tells me that, oh, he plays for Grinnell, folks, he's got 28 points a game in 18 minutes, and he's shooting like 38% from three. So I don't want anyone to put the Grinnell asterisk on this kid. He's from New Zealand. He's going to have a great accent. And I digress, Luke. What are your final thoughts here on the QCast today as we talk about all things men's basketball national committee?
I mean, I've experienced it firsthand this year, just the level of competition in Division III basketball. And it's kind of, it's one of those things everyone says every year, oh, there's so much parity and there's so much parity. But I think just seeing more and more teams go out and play quality opponents and challenge themselves and have these huge matchups, whether it be in the Great Lakes Invitational or other other non-conference games that happen throughout the year. I mean, anybody can beat anybody, and they're really, really good basketball teams. Jim Haney is shouting it from the rooftops that the product that we're out there on the floor right now in Division III hoops is just phenomenal. And so obviously we have some exciting weeks ahead of us as we go through our final rankings and selections, but just chomping at the bit to get to that NCAA tournament, because I know it's going to be one for the record books.
It will be, and we look forward to seeing you there in Fort Wayne. And by the time you get there, it's amazing to me how like relaxed and relieved some of you committee guys look when you finally get to the final weekend after this beatdown that is all these weeks. So kudos on a great job, Luke, and the transparency. I saw you on Hoopsville. That was great. You've been on here several times. Really appreciate it. And to me, anyone that cares to learn how it works, it's like all the information's right out there. So Luke Flockerzi, the head men's basketball coach of Rochester, good luck to you and your crew as you go down the stretch in the brutal UAA while also managing this side gig you've signed up for here. Luke, really appreciate it as always, and this has been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate you having us on.